We're talking today with Shari Levitin about the brain science behind dealing with objections. Why is it that our customers feel the need to give us excuses and objections anyway? Well, you'll find out exactly what's going on in their brains that makes them do that and what you can do about it so that you can help them get to the point where they can make a good decision for themselves. Shari shares with us the 6 objections that are true for any industry, and if you're prepared for these 6, you're really good to go. And she also talks about how you can build in baby negatives to your sales story. There is a way that you can build trust with your customers. She shares so much with us in this interview. It is no wonder that Shari's consulting company, the Levitin Group, is one of the fastest growing companies in America on Inc. magazine's list. You're in for a real treat. Hi, we're here today with Shari Levitin, and we are going to learn her expertise in really dealing with the final objection and making sure that you're not reacting to excuses, but actually something really valid in the customer's mind. So Shari, can you help us understand, what do you mean by the final objection?
Okay, Mary, thank you. If we look at objections as a whole, there's objections that we get during our sales presentation. And many of those are disguised as questions, but they're really objections. But what I wanted to talk about today is the final objection. And what I mean by the final objection, Mary, is the objections you get at the moment of truth, when you ask for the money, when you ask for the sale, when you actually have gone through your closing process. And the reason is, Mary, I find that the biggest mistake salespeople make is they confuse objections with excuses. And then they end up responding to the excuses rather than the real objection. And we always say in my seminars, if you're responding to something that's not real, it's sort of like trying to hit a hologram. You can keep smacking at it, but it's not real. So you're never going to get to what's really going on for the customer. Right. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to talk about.
So Shari, how can a sales rep recognize the difference between an excuse and an objection? Because I'm sure both trigger some emotions in them. How do they recognize the difference?
Well, that's a great question. And you recognize the difference because there's certain things that are what I call core objections or real objections. And excuses are things you hear like, send me a proposal. That sounds great. I'll run it by my board. We need to think about it. They're sort of buzzwords. They're sort of corporate slang, if you will. The real objection, I've broken down into 6 real objections that you would get when asking for the sale. So there's really 6 core objections. And in all my years in sales training, I've found that any objection a salesperson might get sort of fall into one of those 6.
Excellent. Well, I hope you're willing to share those with us.
I am. What I think is important first, before we talk about that, is why. I always like to look at the why behind the what. And I find that if salespeople understand the psychology or what's going on in the mind of the consumer, you're really ahead of the game, because once you understand the why behind the what, it's much easier then to overcome objections and use your own creativity. So if you don't mind, Mary, I'd like to talk about why is the customer giving you an excuse? You've just spent all this time building rapport. For a one-call close, you've probably spent 2 or 3 hours. For others, you've spent maybe 3 to 6 months. Why is this person that you've built a relationship with so reluctant to tell you the truth? Why are they giving you an excuse?
Right.
So I thought that would be an interesting place to start.
Yeah. So why is it? Yeah, that they are uneasy and in need of an excuse.
Well, I think the way to understand it is to look at the human brain and then think of yourself as a consumer, how you are. I think many people have had the training, or perhaps they haven't, on the triune theory of the brain. So I'm going to brush up on it for those who haven't heard about it. This was first brought to light by a gentleman named Paul MacLean. And the triune theory of the brain is also talked about in Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence. Dr. Dan Baker talks about it in What Happy People Know and What Happy Companies Know. And real quickly, what we learned from the triune theory of the brain is that all mammals have 3 parts to their brain. So we've got in our brain the reptilian brain, which is the fight or flight response. And you'll see how this makes sense in the sales process in just a minute. So when an animal gets into fear, that animal will fight or flee. Now, the reptilian brain has been around for hundreds of millions of years. This is how humans learn to adapt in the wild. If you think about it, if you're trying to survive, you're going to need that reptilian brain to kick in. What happens when we go into our reptilian brain is we actually have a physical change. So hormones are released like cortisol, adrenaline, all the blood, for example, will leave our organs and go into our muscles. We've all heard the story of the woman whose baby's underneath the car, and all of a sudden she's got superhuman power to lift up that car. That is the reptilian brain. And the important part about this, when we put it into the sales process, is that when you're in your reptilian brain, you're not using your creative self. You don't have access to the larger part of your brain or your neocortex. When an animal or a human is in fear, all they can do is fight or flee. And again, this is an adaptation that happened for our survival.
Right.
The second part of the brain, I'm sorry?
Right, yeah, and it's not particularly useful to lose all the blood in your brain if you're trying to sell.
Or if you're trying to buy.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, and you make a good point, because as salespeople, don't we go into our reptilian brains? So that's something always to consider. The second part of the brain is the happy place. Hopefully, you go to your midbrain quite a lot. We're in our midbrain when we're in love, when we're listening to a great song. If you've ever had the experience of driving in your car and all of a sudden that great rock and roll song comes on from high school, all of a sudden you're home, you have no idea how you got there. That's the midbrain. That's the happy place. And then there's the smart brain, or the neocortex. And this is where we go when we're learning new concepts. Balancing a checkbook, for example, or learning the particulars of a product or service. Now, here's the part that's important for sales, and to many people, this is key in closing. So I want to share these two thoughts now that we've learned a little bit about the triune theory of the brain. And that is, it is physically impossible, if you look at how the human brain is constructed, to be in two brains at once. So we can't possibly be in fear or the reptilian brain and the neocortex concurrently.
Okay.
Now, here's the other thing that's really fascinating, is when a customer or a person is in their reptilian brain, they can't move to their thinking part of the brain without first passing through their happy place. Or their midbrain.
Okay.
It's impossible.
Okay.
So what does that mean for the closing process? Let's think about it for a minute. And I'm sure people are having light bulb moments right now. Very often, when we ask a customer for the money, what happens is they go into what brain?
That's what triggers their reptilian brain. They need the defense.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So what we're seeing, Mary, then, is that when somebody goes into their reptilian brain, all of a sudden they're in a fight or flight mode. And if you think about it, there's a lot of reasons that people get nervous when we ask them for the money. They're thinking, everything from, oh my goodness, am I making the right decision? Is this the right choice? I don't know if I'm ready to make it today. But realize that they're in a state of fear.
Right.
Very often.
Yeah,
now,
it could be the scarcity of, if I buy this, then I don't have money to buy something else, or whatever. It's a challenge.
Absolutely. A husband and wife are at a car lot. Husband gets really excited about the car, and the woman's thinking, oh my God, I wanted that money to redo my kitchen.
Right.
Absolutely not. Now, here's the important point. So what do we as humans do? And again, if you put yourself in the place of the consumer, what happens is we automatically want to give an excuse for several reasons. If we're in fear, are we really going to tell a salesperson, I'm nervous? Absolutely not. We're going to make an excuse.
Okay.
So picture the customer is in one of three emotional spaces. when we ask them to buy. Usually, they're either scared, okay, or they're suspicious. We haven't earned enough trust throughout the sales process, or maybe they're even embarrassed. Maybe they're embarrassed because they're not sure they can afford it. They're not sure they completely understand it. They really want to run it by. They're not a real buyer. Exactly. They were shopping you. And who's going to say, well, I'm not a real buyer? Right.
Right, exactly. Or they're not the decision maker, but they've been playing that they are.
Precisely. So when we start with that in mind and we think, okay, I have a customer who still very well could be a buyer, because we all know no questions, no objections, no sale. So I've got somebody who just gave me this knee-jerk, instant, reptilian brain response. Now, the worst thing a salesperson can do, which I find many novice salespeople do, is they challenge it. So the customer says, I really need to think this over. And the salesperson says, well, what do you mean you need to think it over? I've given you plenty of information. And they change face. Okay, and they're attacking this excuse. And again, that's the worst thing that you can do, because then if someone's in fear, they're going to move from an emotional state of fear to an emotional state of more fear, or worse, anger.
So how do we handle this situation? How do we help a buyer through that?
Well, what I found works the best is, again, once we as salespeople understand, okay, I have a customer who, like any other customer, gave me a knee-jerk reaction. My whole goal in closing is to get to the real objection and to get to the final objection. Otherwise, like I said before, we're just hitting a hologram.
Okay.
So how do we do that? And if this is probably the most important phrase I will give today, and that is, we must change the emotional state before we change the deal. So very often a salesperson will get, oh gosh, I don't know, I need to think about it. And the knee-jerk reaction is to change the offer. Oh, they'll think, well, it must be too expensive. Or, I'll give them a better down payment. And all of a sudden they start dropping the price or changing the deal or showing something less expensive, when very often that's not the objection at all. And in fact, you're going to lose credibility and start to lower your commission if they do buy, because now you've lowered the deal or changed the deal. So one of the things that we share with salespeople is, if you get something that you feel is an excuse, and you'll know if it's an excuse, think of this person in their reptilian brain and think, all I have to do right now is move them into their midbrain. Because unless I get them into their midbrain, I can't get them into their neocortex to access what's really bothering them. Because a lot of times the customer themselves don't even know what's really bothering them.
Exactly. Okay. So now how do we get somebody to their happy place?
Right. So there's a myriad of ways we can do that. So one of the ways that we can do it is we can take all of the pressure off. Okay? So when I say take all the pressure off, what we might do is say, gosh, no problem. You need some time to check with the other decision makers. I completely understand, this is a big purchase for your company. Makes a lot of sense. And I tell salespeople sometimes, just start even putting away your things if you're in front of them in a briefcase, because the very act of looking like you're moving on, there's just sort of this relief. Okay, good. They're not going to, high pressure me, or they're not going to, keep going at me. And very often when we take all of the pressure off, the customer right away goes back into their happy place. And you may even want to start building rapport again. No problem. We teach a close called the "If It Were Next Week" close. And the way that close works is, when the customer says, we need to run it by the board, or we need to think about it, we physically tell the salesperson to say, yep, no problem. And I'm going to, grab my stuff now and start to say, great. How long do you think you'll need? And I might take out my cell phone to my calendar. When can we meet again after you've gotten some more information? And you go through this whole process. You may even set an actual appointment. So now the customer is relieved. Okay, I'm not going to be asked to make a final decision. Then what the salesperson would do is say, let me ask you this. Let's just fast forward to 2 weeks from now, because the customer told you, we can talk in 2 weeks. As you're leaving, what concerns do you think you might have at that time? And it's amazing. But I'll tell you, 60 to 70%, the real objection will come out. Why? They've gone from their midbrain to their reptilian brain. They're relaxed.
Or their
when they're
executive
in fear,
brain. Yes.
All they're going to do, that's exactly right.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So you've gotten them thinking again, and your question, too, puts them in a thinking mindset of, let's flash forward, and what are you going to be thinking or concerned about after you meet with the board?
Right. So the most important thing in closing at the back end is we've got to isolate the objection to make sure it's the real objection and the final objection. But again, the step before we do that is to change their emotional state so they'll give you the real objection or the final objection. I've seen salespeople completely change the subject. Let's say they're with a customer, they might say, when did you start with XYZ firm? And, that's fine, we'll talk then, and they'll just completely change the subject. And it sounds like it's transparent, but if it's done correctly, it's really not. If you're talking B to C, where did the two of you meet? And by completely changing the subject, the customer is going to get out of that reptilian brain. So that's step number one. Now, step number two, and I find it's very hard for salespeople to do this, is we need to isolate the objection. And very often we'll get a final objection or an excuse such as, I need to, look at other products or whatever. And right away the salesperson will jump in and say, well, here's why our product is superior to the competition's. The correct response should be, fair enough. So if I hear you correctly, you want to check out some other companies, make sure that this is the absolute best company. I completely understand that this is a huge decision for your company. Let me ask you this. Other than the fact that you want to check out the competition, is there anything else that would prevent you from moving forward? So what I've done is I've isolated that and said, okay, no problem. Again, I've taken the pressure off. Got them back into their midbrain, got them out of their fear. Is there anything else? And that anything else, 9 times out of 10, is the real objection.
Yeah, I can envision considering the excuses like boogeymen or something, and you're just putting a box over it. So we're not going to look at that one anymore. So you don't have to be fearful of that. Now let's look at the rest.
Fabulous analogy. Fabulous. It is. It's the boogeyman. So I'm going to get anything. I need to talk to George, who's in charge of HR, before we can implement your software. Oh, of course, yes, this is the decision. Always want, and sometimes you even make it worse. You go along with it. In fact, you should probably run it by sales and marketing as well. So be on their side. Yeah.
Yeah, because then you're not a challenger anymore. You're a friend.
Exactly. But then, now, let me ask you this. If George likes it, is this something that you feel comfortable moving forward with? Or are there any concerns that you have? Bang! That's when you're going to get that real objection.
There you go. So you said that you've got the 6 typical final objections for us. So I'm anxious to hear what those are. And I'm curious if some play both sides of the fence, that they could be an excuse or they may actually be a final objection.
Great question, Mary. Let's start with the 6. And it really depends. Some are emphasized more than others, depending on your industry. But I've found whether it's selling software, selling cars, selling insurance, there really tends to be 6 in any industry that you can put as buckets, which also for those sales managers that are watching, this is a fabulous training technique. because new salespeople get absolutely overwhelmed. How am I going to learn to respond to 100 different objections? Well, really, it goes into one of these six. There's six buckets for objections. The first one is, I don't know if I can use it. We're sort of interested, but I don't know if we'd use it enough. Or you're making a sales call on me. You've got a product. It's kind of a luxury product. It's not a necessity product. I just don't know that I'd get enough use out of this particular product or service. So that's number one. The second one that we see quite a lot is, I just can't make this make financial sense. I don't see the value. And in that is, I want to check out your competition, but I just don't see the value. I could get it cheaper somewhere else. I could get it better somewhere else. But there's just no value for me. The third one is a little more tricky. The third one is, I don't know if I trust you and your company. So all that means is as salespeople, we have not established enough credibility up front. So again, if you're a good salesperson, you're not going to get all these objections at the back end. Hopefully you only have one, and that is when and how we're going to move forward. So the third one is really a credibility one. The fourth one is interesting, and we see this more and more in the new economy, and that is, it's just too complicated. So if we're selling particularly a technology product, they don't want to change. People would rather make no decision than make the wrong decision. And, what we're doing is working just fine. So I don't know that we want to upset the apple cart right now. I think we'll continue doing what we're doing. This looks good. It'll probably make us money. It'll probably work out, but it seems too complicated.
Okay. So that goes along with we're fine with our status quo, I would imagine fits in with that one.
Exactly. And again, who made it too complicated? We did.
Right.
Right. And then the last, what I would call a real objection is real budgetary issues. Not fake ones, but real ones. Maybe we can do it in Q1 of next year, but it's just not in our budget this year. And that's tricky, but it can be a real objection. Or it usually is a real objection.
Right. I would imagine several of those I could see you'd have to do some work to determine, is this an excuse like it's just too complicated? Or is it truly a final objection that, the way we are working is humming along now, for us to disrupt the apple cart? I can't see how it makes sense.
Exactly. And again, if we can just get to that real objection, most of the time we can answer it. But what I found more than anything right now, particularly in the age of information overload, I just heard something on NPR that the average attention span of an American today is 8 seconds.
and did they say what age range? Because for my kids, that might be pushing it.
Yeah, might be pushing it. Now, get this. They say it's 9 seconds for a goldfish. Oh. So I'm sitting here thinking, too bad goldfish don't have credit cards. Right?
Yeah, there you go.
But, attention span today is much less than ever before. And, we're, constantly picking these up. We're picking up our cell phones at the intermission of the movie. We're attached to them. We're attached to all of our devices. And as such, our attention span has dwindled and dwindled and dwindled over the years. So if we don't create urgency now, and we don't get to that final objection now, we're going to get strung along forever. And I see salespeople do this all the time. Oh, yeah, they're going to talk to their board. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. And I've got a basic rule of thumb. The longer you have to wait for your next call with your customer, the more time that goes by, the less likely you are to close the sale. Right. It gets less and less likely.
That makes total sense. I mean, we've got a limited amount of mental space, and the further away you get from being in their mind space, you're forgotten.
Yeah, did you hear that? My device is talking to me now. So can you say that again, Mary?
Well, it makes sense because we've got a limited amount of mental space, and so the further you get out of their mind space, you're just forgotten. There's too much else that takes the place.
That's exactly right. And don't forget that the customer called you because they have a problem. And they see you as a potential solution. And if you called on the customer and they were willing to take your call, again, they were interested enough in your potential solution. The problem is, though, that let's say that their problem is that their revenues are down, and you're selling a software package that you think might, that you know will increase their revenues, and they get excited about it, they get interested. But the longer you wait and the more time that passes between that next meeting and that next meeting, other things are going to come in, and they're going to figure, well, that might be a better solution. So you've got competition. It may not be the same product, but it might be someone else offering a solution to their real or perceived problem.
Okay. So with everything that we're dealing with, I know you have another concept called baby negatives. And so we're working on helping our prospects get over their excuses and really trying to uncover what their true final objection is. And then also we're building rapport through the process, and we're making sure that they trust us so that that isn't an excuse or an objection for them. So where do baby negatives come in? What role do they play?
Another thing that I think is so important today, if you look at any statistics today, Mary, the trust of particularly the American public has gone down substantially since the financial crisis of 2008. We have much less belief as a group in our political system, in our financial institutions. We're much more suspicious. And let's face it, we've got a lot more information now, so we can check things for ourselves. So I find as a salesperson, of course, the image of a salesperson is, oh, they're going to tell me anything just to get a deal. The perception is that, they're going to exaggerate their product or service. So I've always found that the best way to get credibility with a client is to early on tell them what the product won't do. And I have a saying, if we tell the customer what the product or service won't do, they'll believe what it will do. And this is really critical. So, they may ask you a question, does your product come with a warranty? Or, let's say you're selling a real estate product and they say, what's the resale value on these? And tell them, say, the market has been really down lately. So if you're buying this for resale instead of for use, it sounded to me like you were looking for a second home, and that's something you and your family would really enjoy, coming to this nice area where we have these cabins. But no, the value, the resale value traditionally hasn't been very high in the last several years. Tell them, now they'll believe it. However, this is what we can tell you. So again, by giving some kind of a negative, now you have to be sure when you give a baby negative that you're not giving a negative that's so strong it's a deal killer.
Right.
If you have somebody in front of you and the only reason they were buying that second home is because they wanted to make money, that's a bad baby negative to give.
Yeah, not so baby anymore.
It's a large negative. So pick something small, like, one thing I wanted to let you know is that in this particular area, there's a little bit of construction between 5 and 6 because it's, that's when construction, usually happens, or there's, construction going on. Well, whatever you want to say, make sure that you add some negative in there that won't bother them.
Okay. So I can even see partnering this up with affirming an excuse so people feel good about it and they feel like you're on their side. If you tacked on a baby negative, they're going, okay, this person gets me. They understand what I mean.
Exactly. And that minimizes the need to talk to a third party, which of course is an excuse.
Right.
So now we take this full circle. So I'm going to be the third party negative. I'm going to help you see all the downsides to the product so you'll believe the upside.
Right. They want to find that balance. Right. Yeah. If all you do is tell them sunshine and roses, they know there's a thorn there somewhere.
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. And this is a great thing to do with the final objection as well. And it's called making it worse. Gosh, I just don't know if it's in our budget right now. Again, let's take them out of the reptilian, move them into the midbrain. Totally understand. The last thing you want to do is invest in something for your company that's going to, lose you money and lose your credibility. But then you come around, there's a rule. This is called a takeaway, right? A baby negative or a takeaway. If you're going to take it away, you better give it back.
Okay. Okay. So there are techniques then as you have each of the 6 objections, which of course we can't cover the whole universe of your training in one interview here. But certainly people should be looking to how to handle each of those objections to keep people in their happy brain and their neocortex executive functions so that they're not reacting in fear.
Yeah, and again, that's exactly right, Mary. And depending on the industry, exercise that you might want to do after watching this interview, what I would recommend to people is for your particular industry, first of all, write down all of the things that you can do to get somebody in their happy place once you get that objection. So what are all the things I can do? I can move them. Maybe I move space. Maybe I offer them some food. Maybe I change the subject. Maybe I take the pressure off. It's different industry to industry, but I would advise anybody viewing this to, after this interview, write down what are the things that I can do when I get something that feels like an excuse to get them to their happy place. Then what you want to do is say, what technique am I going to use now to, once I get the objection, to isolate that objection? And there's many ways to do it. I can say, other than that, is there any other reason, which is sort of a standby. What I particularly like is when somebody says they want to talk to a third party, which is very, very common today. And then I would say, great, that's a great idea. What objections do you think they might have? Because I guarantee you the objections that they say that the third parties might have is really their objection.
Right, exactly. I love it.
Right.
Yeah. Good. So I love really to simplify our conversation, you're really watching for anything that moves your prospect into fear. And then you should have at your ready a technique that will move them from fear to a more happy emotional state so that they can get back into a thoughtful conversation again with you.
Right. And the line for that, and you may want to write this somewhere, salespeople may want to write this somewhere, change the emotional state before you change the deal.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you for so much packed into one conversation, Shari. This is extremely helpful to help us really understand the difference between an excuse and a valid objection and truly how we can deal with both effectively.
Great.
So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks. It's been my pleasure, Mary. And I just want to end with one thought. And this is something my mentor taught me 30 years ago. He said there's 3 goals of any sales encounter. Number 1, make the customer feel better about you and your company when the transaction is done from when you began. Number 2 goal is to get a sale, not number 1. Because you know what? The world is small. With social media today, goal number 1, no matter what, whether the customer buys or not, make them feel better about you and your company after the transaction is over, whether they buy or not. But it's the 3rd goal that will make you the most money. And goal number 3 of any sales encounter is if you don't get the deal, get the lesson. Know the real reason the customer didn't purchase so you can learn from it and not make that mistake again.
And that makes every engagement a win, regardless of the outcome.
Absolutely.
I love it. Perfect note to wrap on. Thank you so much, Shari.
Thank you for your time, Mary.
Don't you just feel smarter already? I tell you, with all of the interviews that I've done for Sales Mastery, most days I feel like I can conquer the world. If you want to make sure to catch all of our interviews with chief sales officers, experts, top sales producers, connect with us on our YouTube channel right here. And if you want access to all of the resources that we have for you at Sales Mastery, you can connect with us right here. Our goal is to make it fun and to make it simple for you to stay on the leading edge of selling. So connect with Sales Mastery for the smart way for you to become your best.